Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. Facepalmamerica.com is where you can go for more information about our program. You can always listen to past episodes of the program, connect with us on social media. If you want to message us directly or even call, because it's true you can get your voice on this program, you could do so at 202-656-6271. Message, if you're a little bit more shy, that's okay. Or if you are braver, you can call us directly and we will set up a time to speak with you. Something that I have observed, and many people have observed, is that the far right of this country tends to like a good dictator. They have a streak that is just very admiring of authoritarian figures. And certainly the name that crops to the top of that list is Vladimir Putin. And we can see through recent headlines that is probably not a good direction to go in. We have a very bad example there, and it's not the first time. The American right loves folks like Pinochet and Perón, and boy, it's an interesting history. And it has been put together and wonderfully written by our guest today, Jacob Heilbrunn. He is the author of America Last, the Right's Century-Long Romance with Foreign Dictators. Jacob, welcome to Facepalm America. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So tell me, what's going on with the right here? Did they just never get over the loss of King George III?
The right, as you noted, has a long predilection for authority figures. And the curse of the right, of course, has always been this proclivity for order and contempt for rights, liberalism, and the masses. It has long been an elitist movement, even if it has tapped into populist sentiments. And in my book, America Last, what I attempt to do is to talk about the past 100 years. And what I looked at World War I, World War II, and then the aftermath of the Cold War. And it began to dawn on me that the right has essentially used the same arguments over and over to decry what they see as a nefarious deep state, liberal elites, globalists. And it all started, as near as I can tell, in World War I, when you had figures such as H.L. Mencken, who was truly a prodigious force, a brilliant journalist, a polemicist, and a satirist based in Baltimore. And Mencken was ardently pro-German and a Nietzschean. He viewed American democracy with the utmost contempt. He thought that the rabble needed to be kept in check, that the aristocratic South was the one hope for America, and it went up in flames during the Civil War. So Mencken, when the United States, it was a virulent opponent of American entry into World War I. He was a Pavlovian admirer of Prussian authoritarianism and Kaiser Wilhelm I. And from our perspective today, this all sounds a little kooky, but there was a significant German-American population in the United States. The 1916 election, the re-election for Woodrow Wilson, hinged partly on the German-American vote.
Right.
So Wilson, just like his opponent Charles Evans Hughes, was wooing the Germans. And Mencken, and that was one of the reasons it was very difficult for Wilson to enter World War I.
I imagine it has something to do with his campaign slogan that year, he kept us out of war.
Yes, and interestingly, Wilson campaigned on the slogan, America First.
Yeah.
That's where it began. And his opponent, Hughes, also adopted America First. You can never go wrong in America by proclaiming that you're America First. But what struck me about Mencken and others was that Mencken actually wrote an article for The Atlantic that ended up not being published, but calling for Germany to conquer the United States, that the United States would be far better off with Prussian authoritarianism.
Wow.
Now, this may all sound like, woolly-headed romanticism, someone who's, gone a little over the deep end. However, in the 20s and 30s, there was significant revisionism. There was a backlash against World War I. And what we now see is as the right began to coalesce in the 20s and 30s. And Mencken and others were at the core of this. And it morphs in the 1930s into the America First movement. And there are arguments you hear, PA, oh, we shouldn't aid Ukraine. It's a hopeless battle. They're doomed. Why should we waste the money? What do you think Charles Lindbergh and Mencken and others said? They said, oh, we shouldn't aid Great Britain.
Yeah.
They're doomed. Why waste the money? And we look at these figures from the late 1930s, early 40s and call them isolationists.
Right.
In fact, then as now, they were not neutral parties. Roosevelt, thank God, was standing up for American democracy. These people were pro-fascist. They were actively sympathetic to the Nazi regime and believed that the United States should ally itself with Nazi Germany against Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. In effect, they became fellow travelers and enthusiastic backers of the Nazi regime. And in my book, I go into great detail about all of these people, ranging from whether it's Elizabeth Dilling, George Van Horn Mosley, who's a prominent general at the time. These people all testified before Congress. They were on the front page of the New York Times. They were kooks, but they were not marginal figures in the environment of the 30s and early 40s.
What seemed to be the common cultural strains here with regard to those who, certainly at that time and moving forward, supported authoritarianism from the right? I mean, certainly you can look at the antebellum South in America and see its aristocratic tone. And you can see certain things growing out of that. Maybe that had an influence on Mencken as someone from Baltimore. But what do you see as the cultural commonalities that come forward to have such an affinity with authoritarianism in what you would think would be a very anti-authoritarian United States?
We wouldn't think it today, but a lot of it originally came out of New England and Harvard and elite universities. The people that I'm discussing in my book are often quite sophisticated, much as today Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, all these people go to Ivy League universities and then they condemn them and posture as though they are populists. But a common cultural identity, many of the New Englanders were worried. You have to remember, this was a time of millions of immigrants from Southeastern Europe streaming into the United States and from Eastern Europe, Jews coming into New York. This sent the New England gentry into a tizzy. And what happens after World War I focus on one person named Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote a bestseller called The Rising Tide of Color, in which he predicted that the United States and the West were going to be swamped by colored people coming into the United States. So what happens in 1924? Stoddard, was quite famous, was cited by Warren Harding. He was an enormously influential figure in the United States. Congress passes the Reed-Johnson Act of 1924. Essentially, for the next 50 years, immigration from Southeastern Europe is strangled. The Los Angeles Times in 1924 called it, quote, a victory for Nordic supremacy, unquote. The whole idea was racial and eugenics, much as we see today, fear-mongering about the Great Replacement. You see Donald Trump doing that again, talking about the other day he was talking about people coming in from the Congo. Who's coming in from the Congo? It's all stirring up racial fear and trying to convince the so-called Nordics, today we would say white people, that they're under threat.
How
And
did
the whole border thing too plays right into that.
how did
It's
how did this change during the Great Depression? Because at the time we went into our spiraling financial crisis in the late 20s, early 1930s, there were some, and not just on the right, who basically said we need a dictator in order to get us through these times, or we certainly need to hand over to the president dictatorial powers, and that is something that ultimately, did end up happening in many countries in Europe, largely in response to the economic crisis. It didn't happen in the United States, but there were those on the right who said we should have a dictator, and then there were once FDR began pushing through the new detail, they accused him antagonistically of being a dictator, even though that was something that many of them had advocated. Rather strange.
there was Senator David Reed from Pennsylvania in July 1932 said, if we ever needed a Mussolini, we need one now.
Yeah.
A lot of the business elites wanted an authoritarian president to crack heads, to crush the labor movement. One of the people that I focus on in the book, Merwin Hart, met with Hoover and told him that he needed to cut spending more to reverse the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And there was actually what they call a business plot against Franklin Roosevelt. There was a coup that was contemplated by leading businessmen against Franklin Roosevelt. It's a very turbulent time. What I should point out is that I'm not just saying that the right wing has an affinity for dictators. We've also seen the fellow travelers on the left who went to the Soviet Union, who went to Mao's China, who's idolized Fidel Castro's Cuba. All those things occurred.
Huey Long in Louisiana certainly was a populist figure on the left who had the potential to become something like that at a certain point.
Right. What I'm just saying is that we have not, for whatever reason, no one has, as far as I know, has systematically pulled together the right-wing version of this. And for many years, I myself was convinced, I thought, during the Cold War, the 80s and 90s, I thought, well, there is no such right-wing phenomenon because generally conservatives are happy with the United States. Well, now it turns out that at various periods, they have not been so happy with the United States. And in fact, to use Gene Kirkpatrick's famous phrase, they like to blame America first.
Yeah.
All of this came to a head in the 1930s for the first time when you had active conservative support for Franco's Spain and Mussolini's Italy, and not least Hitler's Nazi Germany. Yeah. William Randolph Hearst, for example, cut business deals with the Fuhrer. There were many people, including Lindbergh, who accepted medals from the Nazi regime. They defended the Nazi regime, and they argued that consistently on the right, when you were talking about cultural influences, consistently argued that Jews were subversives and communists that we had brought into America and that posed a threat to our liberty.
Now, you would think that World War II would temper this tendency a little bit, since we had taken on Hitler, we had taken on Mussolini, we had fought and beat the dictators. There were millions of American soldiers who had, faced the forces of authoritarianism in the field of battle and had direct and visceral experience with that. But did they turn around? Did they say, "Oh, okay, we're going to cast aside our predilection for authoritarianism"? Is that what they ultimately did?
You would think this, but you would be wrong. Many of them on this right-wing fringe argued immediately after World War II that the true dictator